everyone, how are we doing? Today we're going to talk about an interesting, I always say they're always interesting, don't I? Alright, so today we're going to talk about a objection that atheists, the Dawkins-esque type people usually have. And so, stop me if you've heard this one before. It says the problem with saying that God created the universe is then that brings up the question as who created God, right? And then people like Dawkins, they then insist that if you then ask, well, who created God? And if, let's say you had an answer to that, you could say, well, so and such created God. But then you'd have to ask, well, who created the creator of God? And he says, if you go back into an infinite regress in that sense, then the whole idea becomes absurd. And this is the thing, he's actually right. But here's the thing, right? The fact of the matter is if you ask who created God, then as far as Christians are concerned, you're thinking about the wrong God, right? Because in paganism, that's actually true. The gods were created. So for example, if you look at the Greek mythology, the gods were created by the Titans, and the Titans arose out of the primordials. Basically, it's actually evolution, to be perfectly honest, right? But in Christianity, this is not the case. If we say, well, God created the universe, but God is uncreated, and they say, well, the response to that is usually, well, you're just defining it for the sake of convenience, right? As if to say, well, we conveniently stop it at God, and that's just a mere convenience of rhetoric, and so then we avoid the burden of explanation. But here's the thing, we don't, right? It's actually logical that it has to stop at some point, right? The regress backwards has to stop at some point. And here's the thing, right? For Richard Dawkins and for atheists, they actually have the same problem, right? Well, the universe created you. Well, who created the universe? Where did the universe come from? And then you have the same thing, right? And basically they have one of two options, is to say, well, the universe was either created out of the multiverse, in which case, well, what created the multiverse? And then you have the same ad infinitum absurd problem that Dawkins accuses us of. But if they say, no, it was the universe created itself, well, then you have a self-refuting statement, because in order for the universe to create itself, it first has to exist, and if it already exists, then it doesn't need to be created. But if they say, well, the universe has just always existed, then they're doing the same thing as saying, well, that we are saying that God has always existed, but then the universe has always existed. But this is the problem then, is that we know that the universe hasn't always existed forever. We know that the universe started, and this is one of the facts of science, that the universe had a beginning. It was actually the preference of most people until Big Bang and things of that sort came out and was discovered in the early 1900s, that it was their desire to see a universe that has always existed, or that went through cycles of expanding and shrinking, which is actually the Hindu view, by the way. The Hindus believe in a cyclical universe of expansions and contractions, right? Which is wrong, right? And it's scientifically wrong, but we're not here to discuss Hinduism today. So the Christian view is, at some point, there has to be the final source. If you go back in, this was created by that. So contingent. Things are contingent means they owe their existence to something that came before them. So for example, you are a contingent being, right? Your existence relies on the existence of your parents and all the way back. And so the Christian answer is that it ends up at God, right? And now, why isn't this merely a thing of convenience, where we say that God is self-existence? He is the final thing. Think about this logically, right? As you go back, and this is why the universe, or this is why it's absurd to say that the contingency problem, to say that contingency goes on forever, right? So if the universe, then the multiverse, and then the multiverse owes its existence. The reason why that's absurd is, if you go on to infinite, is for the following reason. Let's say you're going to borrow a cup of sugar, right? So you're going to go to your neighbor's house and you're going to say, listen, can I borrow a cup of sugar? But they don't have a cup of sugar, and they say, listen, wait here, I'm going to go next door and I'm going to ask my neighbor for a cup of sugar. And let's say they go to their neighbor, and the neighbor says, no, I don't have sugar, but wait here, I'm going to go to my neighbor and I'm going to ask them for a cup of sugar, right? What happens? If this carries on forever, are you ever going to get your cup of sugar? No, right? At some point, someone has to have the sugar. They have to actually have it and possess the sugar themselves, right? That sequence has to stop, because if that sequence carries on forever, you will never get the cup of sugar. And it's the same thing with life. So when Christians say that God is uncreated, right? What we're saying is actually very, very, very logical. If the universe is contingent, it had to come from somewhere, and at some point this regress backwards has to have a definite starting point where whatever created has to exist, because it itself is existence, or it itself is life. And that is actually the Christian point, right? God created. Where does God come from? God doesn't come from anywhere. God exists, and as we say in philosophy, or should I say as the philosophers say, not we, because I'm not a philosopher, as the philosophers say, God is a necessarily existent being. He exists by the necessity of his own nature that basically makes it impossible for him to not exist, right? So at some point, and this is actually the Christian point, God is a necessarily existent being. He exists by the necessity of his own nature. He didn't have a beginning. He is the one that he has the cup of sugar. He has life. He is life. He is the originator of all things, and he exists by the necessity of his own nature. He is self-sustaining. He is self-existent, he is self-contained, and he relies on nothing else in order for his existence. And here's the interesting thing. Well, it's all interesting, isn't it? A lot of in terms of atheism, they will object and say, well, the multiverse, right? So replace God with the multiverse. But now here's the problem. In the multiverse, right, everything that can happen does happen. Right? Every single thing that can happen does happen. I mentioned it in one of my other videos. Because the multiverse, they say that the multiverse is just this universe, random universe generating mechanism that just spits out universes, right? And they say that there's something like 10 to the power of 500,000 universes, or something completely absurd like that. Like more, the number, you can't even understand what that number, how many universes there is, and every possible variation of universe that is possible exists, right? So there is a universe. So according to them, if everything that is possible, everything that can happen does happen in the multiverse, that means that there's a universe out there where Richard Dawkins is a Christian. Right? But now here's the thing, right? One of the ways in which we define God, or that God defines himself in the Bible, right, is not only is he the I am, and that's why God says I am that I am, that he's literally saying I exist by virtue of my own existence. I am self-sustaining. That's what the Bible means when he says I am that I am, right? That's what it means. I am necessarily existent. I exist. I am that, and that's it. Full stop. I am, right? So in the multiverse, right? So everything that can happen does happen. So whatever is possible exists without a doubt in some universe out there. But now here's the thing, right? God, not only is he necessarily existent, right? He's also omnipresent. Okay? Therefore, if it's possible for God to exist, then God does exist by virtue of the atheistic paradigm. If it's possible for God to exist, then he definitely exists. And if God definitely exists, then one of the properties of God is omnipresence. Therefore, if God exists, if it's possible for God to exist, then God does exist. And if he's omnipresent, not only does he exist in one of these universes, he exists in every single universe, including ours. So you can tell through philosophy and through just logic and reasoning and things like that, that it's actually impossible to get rid of God. It's impossible for him to not exist. Absolutely impossible. He has to exist. No matter which way you cut it, he has to exist. At some point in the process, if you go backwards and backwards and backwards, you have to end up at God. An intelligent being that exists by virtue of his own self, of necessary being. And that's what we mean when we say God is necessary. He has to exist. It is impossible for him to not exist. And that, ladies and gentlemen, when people are like, well, where does God come from? How do we explain him? That is how we explain it. And as far as we can tell from the Bible, when God says, I am that I am. I am because I am. I exist by the necessity of my own nature. I am life. I am the source of all things. And the buck stops with me. That's what God is basically saying. So, I hope that clears that up for you guys and didn't complicate it too much in like a short little space of a video. So, that's the question for you. I hope that helps. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and, give us a shout out, subscribe and share and all that good stuff. And I'll spot you guys around next time. Thank you for watching. Cheerio.